Good morning. My name is Scott Choppin. I'm glad to be here with you all today. Thank you to Betsy and Dennis for inviting me. I very much a feeling of gratitude to be here amongst all you folks who are working on housing innovation. My story is a little bit different, and I'm going to speak about rental housing today, so I'm going to be a little bit of a different offer, but I enjoy that. We like to disrupt. My story as far as a developer is I basically lived in two different types of development in my early career. I spent a number of years with a company called Choppin Road. And in that was a corporate offer, and we were an affordable housing developer. So we were a syndicator developer of affordable housing. I spent about 4.5 years there. You guys now know it as KB Home, Choppin Road in the old days. And we were an internal corporate offer building affordable housing. On the other end, I went to work for a company called Ceres Regis after that, regional home builder and apartment developer in Orange County, and that was a market rate offer. And so in the early parts of my career, I sort of had feet in both worlds, both affordable housing and market rate housing, and that's going to be a key factor in what I'm going to talk about later today. So just a couple things on this slide. I don't put the magazine cover up there because I'm vain, although it's cool to be on magazine covers. But what I wanted to highlight for you guys is that we are getting a lot of recognition for producing a new innovation in the workforce housing and rental space. Multifamily Executive, Globe Street have recognized us for these innovations, and I'm happy for that. My thinking about this is, ours is one interpretation of innovation in housing, and we need thousands of more. And in fact, that's why I'm encouraged to be in this room today with y'all. The property on the lower right, just to make a little claim on having built in Denver, we did a 453 unit market rate deal in Westminster, Colorado. And in fact, that was one of the last market rate deals that we ever did. And what I mean, but when I say that the last market rate deals is that we are now exclusively focused on a workforce housing model. And what is workforce housing? In fact, let me ask the question. Just raise your hands. What do you guys define as workforce housing? Just raise your hand and yell it out. Okay, affordable. What else? Okay, transit. Do we think about, so affordable is incomes? Yeah. So the reason I asked that, today we've talked about attainable housing, and there's different ways of describing it. We call it workforce housing. And for us, what this means is that ours is a rental housing offer, like I talked about. And we're working to serve families between 80 and 120% of median income. So you saw some of the stats from the Charles Lesser speaker earlier. And in fact, if anybody was on the tour yesterday, the Panasonic people actually had a slide in their micro unit that showed income categories, and they specifically identified the missing middle. So the three trends that we're tracking, the first two I see as threats or problems, and the last one is an opportunity. But these are the sort of the mission that we have in delivering this type of housing. So the first one, we all know this in this room, we're producing the lowest rate of housing that we ever have historically. I like this graph because it shows it on a per capita basis. So we get out of, this market produces more, that market produces less. This is a national average. It's on a per capita. Now, obviously in 2008, we were at our lowest production rate. Why we know that? We're all familiar in this room. The second one is, in fact, the other speaker had a graph that was similar, but I like this graph because really, although we're up 16%, Betsy's statistic was 16% up on income. If you look at this graph, incomes are flat, virtually, right? And the housing costs, in this case, this is rental housing, is going up at a fair clip. And in fact, in the middle between those two, the gap is where we make our offer, right? What we look at is we say middle-income families, they make too much to qualify for affordable housing, and they don't necessarily afford luxury rental housing, or that may not be coherent with their lifestyle. We live in between that gap. And then the last one is an interesting stat, and I always like to show this graph because I don't think it's really in everybody's mainstream thinking process, but we're talking about multi-generational housing. Multi-generational in this is two or more related generations living in the same household. In our demographic, for the folks that rent our housing, we usually see three. Usually it's three or more generations. And in this case, it's a little bit hard to see this graph, but we're at 64 million people in the United States that live multi-generationally. And if you look from the lowest point, which is in the 1970s, we're up something like 40 million people that are moving to a multi-generational lifestyle. So the way I'm going to present is in really two domains. One is how are we producing value, or what I call margin utility. In other words, what is it that we're doing that provides an extra to the tenant in this case? So our offer is called UTH, or Urban Townhouse, and our specific innovation is pairing private capital with a workforce housing model. And in this case, we're able to do that through numerous efficiencies of buying land in middle-income neighborhoods, in doing some of the production methodologies that some of the other speakers have talked about. But in this case, what makes particular difference is that we're only building 5-bedroom, 4-bath, 3-story townhomes at 1,750 square feet. We're specifically building to a middle-income or moderate-income working family demographic. In California, in Southern California, Orange County, where we build, is predominantly Hispanic families. Between 6 and 10 people in a family group, generally all related, although we may have extended family. And in this case, we build a 3-story townhouse because in our minds, this is the maximum, this is the crossover of maximum rent generation, but still in the right income categories with the lowest cost build, which is a 3-story townhome model. If we go up to 4 stories in California, we start doing extra stairwells, more heavy-duty sprinkler systems. And then, interestingly enough, we're able, in all of our units, and want to actually provide a 2-car direct access garage. And particularly in the neighborhoods that we're in, we're low and lower middle income neighborhoods, think blue collar, working class neighborhoods. Safety is an issue. And so we like to be able to provide the parking, because obviously we have the larger families, but also it provides a certain amount of security. If somebody works a night shift and comes home at 2 o'clock in the morning, they can roll into their unit, open the garage door, and drive in and be safe. And then the last two things are multi-generational. So all of our units in our 5-bedroom, 4-bath unit all provide a ground floor bedroom bathroom. That's standard. We don't do anything that doesn't have that, is another way to say it, because our families are always going to have grandmother, grandfather, older in-law, and anybody who has any sort of mobility issue would be on this ground floor so they can be with the family, but not necessarily have to hike up 3 stories of stairs. And then we're naturally serving incomes between 80 and 120. So in Southern California, Los Angeles, let's say 80 to 120, echo what Betsy's numbers were, but let's say we had a family that made 110,000. 30% of income is about 3,000, and our units rent between 3,000 and 3,500. Now that sounds like a lot, except remember we're 5 bedrooms, we're 1,750 square feet, and most importantly, the value ratio is about $1.80 to $2 a square foot in a marketplace that's $3, $4, $5 a square foot for any sort of new housing. And then the last is we're located in the existing neighborhoods where these tenants already live. We're not producing any housing that is not already coherent with their lifestyle, where they live, how they live, right? They share rents and incomes, or incomes and expenses across the family group, okay? So the other part of the innovation is that we're pairing this up with private capital. So the way I think about true affordable housing, which is tax credit finance, home funds, anything that's at or below 60% of median income, that's always a finite supply because it's limited by the amount of government subsidy that's available. And there's never enough. Supply will always outstrip demand. And so our thought was, how can we figure out a way to pair private capital to produce, market yields or market superior yields, and pair that up? And we've been able to do that. A few things that investors in our discussions with them are very encouraged by is, one, we're delivering new units into deeply undersupplied neighborhoods. Most of these neighborhoods that we built in haven't seen new housing in sometimes 10, 20, 30 years even. We're building in Orange County right now in a neighborhood that I think it's been 40 years since any new housing was built. The family groups have strong social networks locally. So their kids are in school, their jobs are close by. These are not heavy super commuter families. They can't afford the vehicles to commute long distance, so they tend to choose their housing that's co-located to where they work. And that makes them very stable families. So I don't say we want to take advantage of these families. We always say, hey, if anybody could choose to rent a house and could afford it, they would. We just say we're going to be delivering new units that are coherent with their lifestyle. Again, naturally serving. And when I say naturally serving, in other words, we're able to deliver these middle income rents that fit in these income categories without subsidy. So we're just using standard debt and private capital to deliver that. Programmatically, we've delivered 22.66 IRR over the lifetime of our demonstration phase, which was the first set of projects that we developed to test the model. It's in fact delivered beyond what we expected. And then the last thing, and I'll talk about it a little bit in the last slide, is that this is a social impact investment. Right, we are providing housing for middle-income families that are being dropped ever lower on the food chain in housing, and they're either paying greater percentage of income to rent. So Betsy's stat was 33%. We're seeing families that are paying 50, 60, 75% of their rent or income to rent. And that's just too much. They're under huge stress. So to close out, I just got a minute or two. So the innovation is pairing workforce housing, the way we define it in our model, with private capital. And there's really 4 stories that we think about when we talk about this housing. So one is a workforce housing story, which is that we're providing housing for people who work blue-collar jobs, and together in their sharing of incomes can afford the bigger unit that's coherent with their lifestyle. Instead of living in 2 units side by side, they can live in one of our units that's new and has a garage. That this is family housing, right? Most, for those of you who track the apartment market, most of the new rental housing is studio 1 and 2 bedroom units, and it's correctly coherent with a millennial and Gen Z demographic. That's the largest cohort in the United States history. That's a great place to be. It also happens to be where I think there's an oversupply story. And then next is the social impact story. So we're not a mission-based company. We're a for-profit developer, but we do hold both the mission of supplying family housing and making a profit for our investors. We need to do both. Lose any one of those and the model doesn't work. And then the last is that we're able to provide private capital a yield, and we think a market superior yield. We do talk with social impact investors, and I think there's some interest there, and there certainly is an alignment with social mission. But our job first and foremost is to supply housing to working families that's new, growing the housing supply, while also producing yield to private capital. And with that, I'm complete. Thank you.